Well, folks, I think we're going to get started. We're expecting Brent Kay. Given that he has some executive responsibilities with VSA, he might be a little bit late. And I'll have him introduce himself when he arrives. I'm Winton Goodrich. I'm the Assistant Superintendent in South Burlington. But I spent a couple of decades working with the Vermont School Boards Association. And I'm just going to set a context today for what we're going to talk about. It's going to have a slight lean towards policy governance, and it would be good to know just how many districts here are under policy governance systems right now. Okay, and that means everyone else is not, but would like to know more about it. Hopefully our remarks are going to be from a perspective of policy governance, but also how traditional governance districts could use some of the principles that policy governance causes boards and superintendents to operate under. If we get a little bit more PG, meaning policy governance, and not enough TG, traditional governance, let us know, ask questions. We promise we'll wrap up today by 4. That would be all right with you all? Okay, Dana, don't run away. I think we wrap at 11:30. Yes, we do, because apples and coffee trump us. So let me just start by giving a little bit of history. Some of you may know, some of you may not. And I said in a meeting not long ago that policy governance has been around in Vermont for about 10 years. I think it's been longer than that. And it started in the late 90s with some interest that I had and some superintendents had. As we went to national conferences, we began to see workshops on Carver's policy governance system. And it's not about the PG side about it, it's about the clarity of roles and responsibilities. Vermont had a federal grant probably about 10 years ago called the VELA Project, Vermont Education Leadership Alliance, which David Ford and Laura Soares both were directors. And what they did is they did research in governance structures and systems in Vermont and found that the biggest struggle that we have between the role of principal, superintendent, and school board is the lack of clarity of roles, responsibilities, and relationships. And what policy governance does, and good traditional governance does, is clarifies that so that the superintendent knows what they do, the board knows what they do, the principals know what they do. So all PG is just an excuse to do it right. And if you remember nothing else today, remember that. So with that, we're going to move forward. We're going to share examples of monitoring. Why did that go off?
It's okay.
Oh, it's because I went off. Thank you. I know where I went off. We're going to share examples today of what school board monitoring reports can look like. They happen to be policy governance models, but we're going to talk a bit about how you could adapt in a traditional governance district the deeper understanding of school boards, still within your policy role, about accountability. And when you kind of separate out all the jargon and language, it's about accountability, and it's about communication, and it's about roles. So that's setting the context today for how we'll move forward. Brent's going to join us and give us a little bit of context about just what good governance in general is. What I'm going to just start with, I think it makes sense, and I thought I had this teed up, and I do. In South Burlington, and South Burlington is a policy governance district, we focus on 4 N's, or N's policies. And we try to have all staff, and teachers, administrators, and staff focus on academic proficiency, personal development, disposition for lifelong learning, and citizenship. And I would say that most of the policy governance districts have similar kinds of ends policies. And it's just the outcome, it's just where we're going. And again, sometimes it gets a little jargony, particularly for folks that don't know the Carver system as to what ends are. But if you think about it, it's what we would want any of our students to be proficient in when they leave school. So if we talk about ends, that's a bit of what the conversation is about. So I think that's probably enough for now, and we may have Brent come on later, and I think I'm going to shift now to Mark and Kim. to tell you a little bit about who they are and the craft that they practice. And I know both of them have been, as longtime school leaders, in traditional governance districts and have migrated to policy governance. So we'll have the conversation about what it might look like anywhere in Vermont or anywhere in the United States for that matter. So, Mark and Kim.
Thanks. What you need to know is this has not been choreographed, and one of the fun things about panels is we sort of ping off of, I think, the remarks that we'll each make. So with that stated, given the composition of the audience this morning, I'd like to defer to my colleague Kim, who will introduce herself and also give you some context around as a board member in Essex Town, sort of set the stage in terms of our journey that we're on in the town.
Thanks, Mark. I'm Kim Gleason. I have been on the Essex Town School Board, I think it's 5.5 years now. I've got 4 kids, 2 kids in middle school, 2 kids in high school. And I came onto a board in traditional governance and happened to also be on the policy committee, and that was this huge book that it took me a few months to realize. At one point we got to a policy that was about a storage facility that we didn't have anymore. And so I began to question what I was looking at and realized that so much of what we had in our policy book was procedure. And in this case, it was procedure that didn't even need to exist anymore because it was a facility that didn't exist. And it wasn't for lack of great work on behalf of people that had done the work ahead of us. It was that when the book gets like that, you lose track of what it is you're trying to value and monitor. And that's, you monitor what you value, your policies should reflect what you value. And so it was a time in our governance that we had a turnover on our board that was, I think we had 1 person returning, and then 4 new people pretty excited about trying to figure stuff out. And a superintendent at the time, Jim Fitzpatrick, who was becoming familiar with policy governance. And so we took that as an opportunity to look at governance as a whole. And as it was presented to us, one of the board members operating in that model came and did a presentation for us. It was curious, but as I looked at the foundations of what the VSBA provides as our job and role as board members, it wasn't vastly different from the good governance that's described there, and it gave us a model to use. So we took it on basically as, you know, a case study, and we read together the book as a professional learning community and decided that this was a direction we wanted to head. I will say, as a parent, the clarity of roles to allow me to be a parent in my district while I am a school board member in my district, that had tremendous beneficial effects, and I had great teachers who were very respectful of that, whatever model of governance we were in. They knew I was an active parent before, I would be an active parent after. But it did give me the construct for those teachers who didn't understand necessarily that role, that might not be my direct child's instructor that would catch me signing in, or a community member in the grocery store hitting me up. It gave you the opportunity to say, you know, that's really great thoughts. Have you checked with your teacher or the bus driver or whomever it is that they were trying to engage a conversation of a school board member in a context that wasn't about policy. So it provided real clarity of roles of who's responsible for what. And so I take our responsibilities very much to be creating policy that reflects the values of the community, and then holding the administration accountable to producing outcomes for those policies and evidence to that. So the why monitor question that was the title of this presentation struck me as, oh my goodness, how could we not monitor? Because we're asking people for a lot of money, and we're asking them to support the work that's happening in our districts. And so we want to be really clear with our superintendent in fairness about what we are asking, and that clear request needs to be born of what the community values, and then that's what we're going to monitor. And so that happens in creating good policy and providing transparency and accountability. And that accountability looks like monitoring reports in our district. We used to have these great, once a month the principals came and talked to us, and we great reports about what they're doing in their buildings. And we'd have a superintendent report, and that was pretty comprehensive about what's going on in the district. But the context of what it was meaning, the so what, was lacking in what we used to call monitoring. And our monitoring now is all about the so what. And the ends, which are, I think, the biggest, most interesting piece of our monitoring that maybe is easier to communicate with the community because it's around what's happening for kids, is really about, you know, what outcomes do we want, for whom, and at what cost. And that's how we went about defining our ends policies. So when we monitor, we establish in our summer retreat a calendar, and it looks like this.
Is there a way to focus that just a little bit better? Or maybe it's my eyeballs.
No, it's a little bit out of focus.
Okay.
We have a dozen copies if you want to take a look.
Yeah.
Paper copies.
I don't know where the remote is, so.
Oh,
I think it does. I'll look at that.
sorry, I could have done that.
I only got 12 from the front desk.
I could have done that. Sorry.
But we have 12 copies. People will just pass on and share.
So this is work that we do to sort of set the schedule for the year and how often we're looking. Some policies we look at more than once. Some are broken down. Just recently, Mark brought us, I don't recall that it was necessarily even part of the schedule, but this is the other thing that happens when we get reports from Mark on anything. He is framing it in the context of which policy it's responding to. And so when we get a kneecap presentation, it falls most logically under our 1.1.
Okay.
But if all Mark came to us with was kneecap results for showing me how we are achieving the interdisciplinary themes of our core curriculum and other areas of education and the academics, that would not be all that our board is interested in seeing. The process of monitoring is very much so back and forth, and it's been an evolution because I think one of the things that when we created our 1.0 policies, our ends policies, they are broad and sweeping, and they're actually the language in the educational excellence or standards. I apologize, Elaine, I can't recall the document that you guys have produced, but it's a lot of that language around the whole student. And those are really hard to pick the test that's going to give you that. And so as we were creating them, among my hesitancies was, oh my gosh, are we creating something that people can't possibly be responsive to? Because we don't know how they're going to monitor it. And I appreciated Jim Fitzpatrick at the time and his principal saying, let us figure out how we're going to prove it to you. Don't limit what you're asking for by the fact that we can't know just yet how we're going to produce that evidence for you. And that was pretty liberating, and yet, you know, I remain cautious to understand that these are big goals. And they aren't monitored in any single way. It is sometimes direct inspection, and Mark, he's going to share with you a few of the samples. We have written monitoring reports. We have some of them have been very interactive in that there will be online data that we can look at, and then executive summaries that are written. And we provide Mark with some feedback on how that worked for us. We certainly do it directly in the meeting, and then we're, you know, supposed to be reflecting for him and completing a chart that he gives us on, you know, have I proven this? I know we are really lame at that. So we give him a lot of feedback while we're sitting there with him, and thankfully he's taking copious notes because we don't always leave our meeting and do our best job of completing that check the box form for him. But what has been hugely different is that it is not personalized. You know, good policy should be valid no matter who the personalities are sitting there. It should reflect the values of your community. It shouldn't be, this is Kim's passion, and so now we've got a policy for it. It needs to have longevity and be sustainable, and so does monitoring. And so if these monitoring reports aren't reflecting changes because we've inquired about things or said that was great, it was too much on this, what about this piece, I don't think that was hit at all, I don't think we have a situation where Mark feels defensive about that at all, and because he is being responsive versus reactive, I think all 5 of us feel comfortable being honest about sharing our thoughts on the document. It really provides a good structure for depersonalizing it and not making it defensive. We have to be able to prove to our community before we go back out and ask for another 20 million bucks or whatever it is, have we done what we said we were going to do? And in the budget process, it is so much better to be able to look at not just the money being spent, but how that relates to outcomes for kids. And it has, the last couple budget processes, that has been the way all those conversations were framed with Mark. Each of the budget areas, we come in early in the process with, this is what we're anticipating, this is what we're anticipating for the next few years. And these are the resources we think that can achieve this for kids. It changes the entire conversation. It's an investment for homeowners, it's an investment for the district. It's the way we need to be having the conversation, but it has to have evidence. We have to be able to say, we didn't just create lofty goals and we need $20 million to do it. We've been hearing for the last few months about how the resources we're asking for are going to meet these outcomes for kids, and it changes the whole conversation. It's not about a line item anymore.
So the calendar, thanks for great context. The calendar, my name is Mark Andrews. I've been serving the town of Essex. I'm in my 3rd year. Before that, I practiced up in the Northeast Kingdom, helped to transition 7 boards from a traditional way of governing to a governance model called policy governance. So I've had some experience, and it's been a great journey learning with the community and the board along the way. This is a document that Kim referred to that really directs the board's work and my work during the course of any given year. Please know that there's a lot of other things that the board addresses during their time together, but this really is reflective of the policies that we have on on record. And as Winton said, and this is not a policy governance workshop, and many of you are practicing within this framework, but as you know, those of you who are practicing PG, is that there are 4 sets of policies, and we didn't want to be presumptuous to think that you wanted to hear about one set. So we're prepared at some point soon to answer any questions you might have in terms of what good monitoring looks like for any given set of policies. One has to do with the board's work and governing their commitment to good governance and leadership, the stewardship of the organization. So they're evaluating themselves, and those are the policies that are addressed in 4s. It's really foggy right now. There's a set of policies that talks about clear delegation of responsibilities to the superintendent, make sure that our roles and responsibilities are absolutely perfect, and they evaluate themselves with my input on whether or not that feedback is spot on.
Could you give one example of the 4s, what one of those would be?
Sure. You want me to take that on? Or
Yeah, go ahead, or I can plug in both.
So one of the beautiful things about policy governance is you're not looking backwards, you're always looking towards the future. You know, we should be visionary in our leadership, in our work. So one of our problems with NECAP is it's sort of a post-mortem. It's looking at how we did the year before. So we need to flip that paradigm and think about policies that focus on the future. And so that said, the investment that boards make in coming to conferences like this is really important, to be thinking about what's out on the horizon, what's the thing that we're trying to shoot for, and the board evaluates themselves on whether or not they're investing the time they need to get better at what they do. Superintendent delegation are in the 3s, and the board is responsible for those first 2 columns of evaluating themselves. 3rd column has to do with executive limitations. Kim referred to the policy book that a lot of you probably had or still have, that's way big. It pretty much is very prescriptive, tells me what I have to do. That model's gone with PG. Executive limitations are about the things that I shouldn't do. It's the thou shall nots. So it opens up a whole different world for me as a superintendent. It's not being prescribed by policies. Policies now read that I should not allow any buildings to be unsafe for kids, but it doesn't tell me how to do that. The policy says I shouldn't treat parents and guardians in a way that minimizes their participation in the educational process without telling me how to do that. So I monitor those policies through monitoring reports, and I have a copy for you today if you're interested, to share with the board the evidence that's in place to demonstrate my claim that I'm in compliance. I'm also not in compliance sometimes, and I'm very honest about that and candid. And through good board feedback, I come back the next time with a report that's more reflective of where the board feels I need to focus my attention. So compliance is not just a perfunctory monitoring report. If you've got the type of relationship that you have with the board, you can have that honest, candid conversation, and it's iterative, that the next round, if you will, the monitoring should get better at trying to address where we want to be per policy. The last is where I think the action is, where the most excitement is, where I have the most fun in my job, and that is being able to demonstrate to the board the outcomes that they have identified in their ends policies. And again, as Kim referred to, it's not just empirical data. So like we saw this morning with that awesome panel of kids, every year we do bring kids into the board. I use that as a monitoring report. Our 8th graders and students who finished their first year in 9th grade at the high school, coming back and having them reflect on the ends policies, whether or not we prepared them to be able to navigate and be successful at the high school level. So monitoring reports are not just written, they're also very hands-on, depending on the report that I'm putting together. Finally, just as an example, and I have another handout, you have the rubric. And you can find this stuff on our website if you're interested. My thesis is that you can't look at ends policies as separate sets of outcomes. They're all inextricably tied together. So how does meeting the core academic requirements in NECAP relate to having to navigate a complex world, or how it relates to creative problem solving or critical thinking? All of those to us are very tied together. So the monitoring reports that I'm bringing forward now don't show separate monitoring reports on any given domain. They're being more and more integrated. What Kim is passing out in addition to one of the written monitoring reports is a performance rubric that we developed 2 years ago. So last April we had a learning exposition that demonstrated pre-K through 8 how kids were using technology to solve important real-time problems in their community. And the board had an iPad. We loaded this template, this rubric, into their iPad, and they actually went and looked at each student's work and scored their work using the rubrics that teachers use. So we felt it was a really powerful way to demonstrate to our trustees, the organization, how the investment of technology is helping kids meet these outcomes identified in their ends policy. So in addition to the so what of this is in addition to just NECAP reports, empirical data, we're actually showing boards through the use of the technology, their own use, what kids are doing with in the classrooms, which we felt was a real powerful learning experience for the board. So at that point, I think I'd just like to stop and wait unless you want to direct otherwise. Questions, there might be some questions.
Yeah, I just, before we open it up, for a number of years I worked with boards on both traditional and policy governance, and now I have an opportunity in my second year at South Burlington to actually see it in action. So, two different perspectives, but I think the issue is we work very hard as an administrative team to get out that data for monitoring reports. I have a couple that I brought. I brought a simple one, and I brought a very complex one. So what we're doing is we're primarily focusing on means. It's either a means or it's an ends monitoring process that we're working on. So I have a transportation report that's a couple of pages, and I have a one-to-one laptop computer monitoring report that I think is 14 pages. So it's just to know that sometimes it takes a lot more data to be able to tell the story. And so I'll pass those out in a moment. But I think with that context, as you have questions, now's a good time to start, because it would be important to begin to engage with you both from a traditional governance and policy governance perspective. And if you would just let us know how you're asking that question, we'll better able to respond. Rama.
Yeah, Rama Schneider from Williamstown. I guess all is traditional governance, I'm not sure. It's kind of actually more of a hybrid than anything else.
Okay.
I have two questions, but I'll save number two in case there's time. But the first one is, we spent a lot of yesterday and this morning learning about breaking down walls for education. This idea of learning anytime, anywhere. It's not just restricted to the building. Is that a concept that policy governance, as described here, the formal policy governance structure, How does that carry over if we think about breaking down walls for the community and the school administration and the school policy-making boards?
That's it's a great question, and if you really get your heads wrapped around the ENDS policies in particular, again, we didn't have time today to share those ENDS policies. You can find them on our website. It's transformational in that you can't come close to meeting the ENDS policies directed by the board if you're not breaking down the walls, and that we have to move towards a 24/7 learning environment that's student-centered, which we heard from kids today. It needs to be addressing their personal needs. It needs to be customized. The ENDS policies as written, they're broad, but when you start to really unpack that and start thinking about the end in mind, what might that look like in our youth, you have to do things differently in school today. You cannot teach the same way. So I believe that, call it whatever you want, if you've got those types of goals, you have to really, really take a look at not only your learning opportunities, but also your pedagogical practice, how you teach. It's all up.
Can I just interject here? And I understand and appreciate what you're saying there, but actually you're answering the wrong question, and
okay.
I didn't express myself well
okay.
enough. The question isn't about the students and how you deliver the education. This question is the relationship between the community and the boards and the administration and the staff. And does policy governance kind of inhibit that breaking down of the barriers and the walls and the communication for those groups?
Sure.
I think the thing I would
Thank you.
say, Roma, is it actually frees the opportunity for that. So Mark was indicating he has a set of policies that are the thou shall nots. You know, in an older version, we might say you must do things this way. So I think the question I heard you ask even the first time around was not, my response to it would be not so much in policy governance or anything else, but your policy should reflect those values you just described. If that's important in your district, your policy, your language, and then the monitoring that will follow from that should reflect the values of the community. So when we set up our policy, we were doing our policies, we did a ton of work with the community. We did a targeted mailing to leaders in the community and had them come in and talk to us. We had a draft document that we were using. We asked them their thoughts. We took their input and had this document reflect what the community in a lot of different groups, a lot of different venues, a lot of different opportunities wanted to see for outcomes for kids. That was what this 1.0 set of policies are about. The broadest piece of it up top is the Essex Town School District exists so that young people are empowered with the knowledge, skills, and attributes needed to prepare them for the next stages of their lives as successful and contributing members of the global society. These efforts will be guided by the principles of the Essex Design for Learning and provided at a reasonable cost. And then we break that down. There's one, the exceed expectation for core subjects in an interdisciplinary theme and focusing on community, global awareness, financial and economic literacy and entrepreneurship, civic literacy. So these are all 21st century skills. The language of our policy is 21st century skills driven. And so that's then, without telling Mark how to do his job, what he has to demonstrate to us is happening. So the first step in the job as a board member in my mind would be make sure your language and policy is reflecting the values of your community and what you're seeking to have happen for kids. And it's not about the building at all. There's not one mention of building in any of our policies, or schedule, or the actual list of core subjects they must have, or number of hours they must sit in seats, or number of credits they must have. So it references things that are in, you know, the legislature that says we have to have meet school quality standards or whatever else is current. But our policy doesn't have that language at all. It's about what you are going to achieve for outcomes for kids.
If I understand the question, better understand it, is that I think as we get better at practicing in this way, the community will be more engaged and more understanding about what's going on in the schoolhouse. Will there be some people who will never really understand the model? Absolutely. But it holds us more accountable to the investment that we're making in kids. So here's an example. That because the only employee under this model that the board has is me, I need to make sure that I'm having the right conversations with building leadership around the work that they're doing in the schoolhouse. And so given the limited time that I have to meet with principals, it's focused on outcomes for kids. It's not focused on the operations. It has to be to some degree, but they better well be talking about with their parent group especially, and educated teacher colleagues and kids, what the policies are all about. So wherever you go in Essex Town, we're talking outcomes for kids. And as we talk about outcomes for kids, we have to show evidence on whether or not that's working. And again, it's taking time, but I believe that Kim is much more informed now as a board member about what we're doing, and parents as well, because of policy governance. It's no longer looking at minutia and operations and do you have the right coach on the field, you know, or the bathrooms smelling the way they should smell. That's not the conversation any longer. So I think that our community is much more aware of what's happening in the schoolhouse today because we're monitoring, we're focusing on evidence. If that answers.
I got a question here, but before we go there, I just want to say, I don't want this to be a sales pitch for policy governance.
Oh,
So
no,
I'm trying to stay away from that. But let me just help you to understand the board operates at a different level, but with greater accountability, if you can understand that. Let me just show you, by state law, every school district in the state has, I think it's 27 mandated policies. Those policies still are in operation in South Burlington, in Essex Town, in Montpelier, in Hartford, any of those districts that are doing policy governance, but they're directed to the superintendent to get them done, with few exceptions. And so here's your list. You've still got substitute teachers, professional development, home study students, all of that. That no longer, the board still adopts those, but they don't tinker around with them much. They adopt them because legally, as an entity, they have to by law, but they're not spending time on them. So hold on just for a sec. So that aside, where the board is spending their time is in the policy governance policies, of which Kim identified. Well, I can't get back here quickly. They're the policy governance policies, which we shared with you the ends. So where they spend their time is on 37 policies that are focused exactly at what Rama is talking about. It's working with the owners, which are the community and the business people, to figure out what the vision for the district is so that we can be targeting on transformational education. So the first hand was here. Is it Erin?
Elin.
Elin.
I wanted to speak to the breaking down of the line between the school and the board and the community. And I think that for our town, it's helped it tremendously. We have much more communication with the community than we used to because it's so clear where you're supposed to be there. 3 different kinds of meetings, and the head lice discussion no longer comes to the school board. And we didn't want to hear that anyway. We kind of shut that down. But now it's really clear there's that PTO meeting in the morning, the coffee with the principal, and that's where you, if you're a parent or a community member and you have an issue that you want to bring up that's means and about what's happening in the school, you go to that meeting. And if you want to help the principal discuss means like how can we better support the arts program and make this giant art exhibition that we have every spring happen, then there's a parent advisory, community advisory group that meets in the evening. And then if you want to talk about policies in the future, then that's the school board. And we do, that's much more outreach where the school board is going and looking for people to come to talk to us. But it's so clearly now, to me, divided, and there are people who are going to all those meetings, and they're different people. And so there seems to be a lot more communication happening with the community now that we've moved to policy governance.
And Elin, you're in Bristol, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So Bristol is a policy governance district. So she's speaking from a practitioner that's actually doing it. I saw a bunch of other hands. Mark?
Yes, on the very last page of the handout.
Which handout?
The last handout. I think it was the last handout.
Okay, so that's the
monitoring report, Essex Town.
Right.
It touches on the superintendent performance monitoring evaluation process. Could you expand upon that a little bit? I assume this is one sheet that over the course of a year, that as board members you're recording this. How do you put that together, and how's it been going?
So it's the feedback form that I was alluding to, the fact that we do a great job in the meetings, being very clear about our feedback with Mark. And we are working on getting better at being disciplined and completing that evaluation form. At the back of the packet was the more, like, our board chair can gather that data. That becomes data that we can then use when we're doing his evaluation at the end of the year. But whatever happens at the end of the year should not be a surprise to Mark. This has been an ongoing dialogue throughout the year of what we're expecting to see. And in policy governance, and I will say my personal bias is that I try and use that label as infrequently as possible, because it's really good governance, and that's relevant to our community. It doesn't, what do they care what the model is called? Or for us, with 4 new people ready to learn about how to do board stuff at all, it was great to have a model to follow. But like I had said in the beginning, it really is good governance, and I think the less we talk about it as policy governance and something that feels like a label, and more use language that our community can understand in terms of, we're looking at outcomes for kids, we're monitoring and providing accountability to those outcomes, and use language that people can talk about. So I'd love for us, or nobody to get hung up on the idea of policy governance or otherwise. For us, it was a great model to follow. In that form, when we can be more disciplined, and it just becomes another piece of evidence that we use when we're monitoring, when we're doing that monitoring report that is the superintendent evaluation at the end of the year. And it puts it all in one place for Mark and for us. I use it to take notes as I'm reading through it and I'm preparing for the meeting. And then invariably, our monitoring reports, Mark provides us data and executive summary that we need to have reviewed before we come to the meeting, but it's not okay, that's it, rubber stamp. It's a dialogue at that point. He doesn't read through the monitoring report. He highlights areas and expands on things, and it creates a rich conversation from a well-prepared board to be able to probe further, to maybe highlight things that we thought were terrific, or provide areas where we thought we really would have liked to have seen more on this, and here's why. So it's not an individual directing him to just do more work. It's okay, this provided in the context of our policy and producing outcomes for kids, this is awesome, and it begs this question for us. And so we would like to see more on that next time, or it might be tabled because we really need to see more on it before we can say we can't pass this one just yet. And that has not been a defensive process at all. It just informs Mark and maybe us being more clear about what we're looking for. But I said these goals, these policies of ours are big, and we didn't know how they'd be monitored when we put them in. And so we really have appreciated the dialogue that happens.
I think superintendent evaluation is a common lament among superintendents, because I don't think it probably doesn't get at all of what we need to get at in terms of giving superintendents feedback. So every monitoring report I bring out from executive sessions to ends, there's a customized form like that. As we get better at it, that should be more timely in terms of when I receive that. And then there's a summative sort of evaluation, theoretically based on those data that are being taken across the year. There's also a lot of ancillary data that are used, how successful I am in contract negotiations with teachers, the ability to meet the community's needs through partnerships and relationship development. So there's a host of things that the board's going to draw from, but these forms you have today are just related to the policies themselves.
And they are actually, as Mark mentioned, that communication and support to the board is one of our policies. So again, we're not monitoring him on things we haven't already defined, and that is a big change from our this model of governance to this model of governance. Like, that was what I was alluding to. There shouldn't be surprises. Communication and support to the board, or treatment of students and staff, those are policies. So it's not an arbitrary, how do we think he did? Those policies that he brings forth to us that are in his thou shalt not category, the 2.0s, come with data that becomes evidence for us when we are doing his summative evaluation at the end of the year.
Let me just jump in and, all right, we'll take the 2 questions here and then I'll transition a bit. Yep.
2 questions within that, but related. Policy governance is a new concept to me since I've been here this last 2 days. It looks like it's a registered trademark, so it is a package type thing that is purchased or whatever, and correct me if I'm wrong, they are prescripted, the policies, and then they get modified?
Let me just clarify, the means policies are pretty prescriptive.
Okay.
The ends policies are what you want for the vision of transformation in your community. So the executive limitations of what the superintendent's going to do, that's pretty standard.
Okay. But you're guided, perhaps? There is guidance towards what you do
I
for
don't
the
know where Val's resources came from, whether it was from the policy governance model book or from 21st century skills.
Right.
But our language is very much so the 21st century skills.
Prescripted, not prescriptive. In
Okay.
other words, there was a
Prescriptive.
script that
Yeah.
said, we suggest that they look like this, and then you modify them.
It was, the bigger areas were scripts, and I think the 2.0s, 3.0s, and like when you mentioned, we had some strong guidance on what those would look like, and there were a couple that we just recently got rid of because we didn't know what they meant when we put them in, and,
Sure.
and we expanded on another, and then, but the 1.0s were very extensive work in our community, and our draft for that came out of 21st century skills, and then we brought that to the community to say, is this reflecting what you think?
Right.
Second part of that question.
Uh-huh.
Any negatives?
Yep. Negatives are people that don't understand the system think you're giving away the shop to the superintendent. What they don't know is, if they look under the hood, the superintendent is far more accountable in policy governance than they ever were in traditional governance, especially in supervisory unions. A superintendent could go board to board and never have to deal with the kind of accountability that they have to with this.
Can I just add?
Yep. Yep.
I'm from South Burlington and actually work with Wynn. I just want to
He's my boss, he's being nice.
One of the biggest negatives, and I also like to hear what Essex folks say, is that you do come up with the ends, and it took us a while to come up with the ends, and we're only just getting into the monitoring. And this is not any news to Wynn, he understands. There's a frustration of, all right, we're setting the ends, we want you to do it, but the monitoring is slow in coming, because a lot of the ends are very difficult to monitor. So there's that kind of frustration that, all right, we don't really know how we're doing with respect to the ends yet, but it's an iterative process. But that's, I think, my at least biggest frustration with the system.
So what you have is an interim process. You're not just not monitoring. What do you do while you're working towards that monitoring?
Well, we've already gotten monitoring reports, but it's not really getting to whether we're fulfilling certain aspects of our ends. It's still a lot of kneecap, a lot of graduation rate, a lot of how many kids are taking AP tests. But again, it's a pretty big thing to try to monitor, but that's one of the frustrations.
That was the multiple approaches we had mentioned earlier with the direct observation or direct inspection, I guess it's called. There's a lot of different approaches to it. We've struggled with, I think we're just a little bit ahead of you guys, and that we're maybe a year or so along that evolution, and it takes time. The thing that is especially enlightening and holding people accountable and having a community understand it's not less, and the superintendent isn't just running away with this, but that you are really demanding more, is to be able to acknowledge we're not in compliance, we're in partial compliance. And I think Mark deliberately chose one that showed where we were not in compliance purposely, because I wanted folks to be able to see. It also is asking for him to tell us his plan to come into compliance. So it's not just that compliance, partial compliance, not compliance. It's, all right, so we're not in compliance, what are we going to do about it? And it's there. It's part of the process. It's that next level of so what? Tell me how we're going to get there.
Got Alice and then John.
Your statement is a little bit of a segue from what I was wondering about, and that is, you know, what's the interface of monitoring and direction and vision setting in relation to those things? I guess I'm wondering, you know, we need accountability and monitoring is required, but so we don't just turn this into a monitoring, madness, and don't have enough opportunity to actually reflect on and back up and adjust. Where's the dialogue, with whom and when? I'm wondering, Mark, maybe both in terms of have your administrative teams changed, your administrative meetings with your principals looked different? Is the dialogue different in relation to this focus? And then how's that dialogue furthered with the board to be sure that, we're on the mark and part of that, I guess, is also, this is sounding a little too convoluted at this point, but how do you prioritize? I'm noticing there's like 21, and every meeting you seem to be monitoring one or the other of those 21. Just thinking of my own boards and time constraints and whatnot. How do we get to that prioritizing as well as adjusting?
Well, I'll see if I can pick parts of your question apart. Has it changed the way we work as a leadership team? Absolutely. Oh my God. Can't imagine what this work has allowed us to focus. There's a companion piece of work that we haven't talked about, and that's about what does a multi-year plan look like to get to the ends. And so we do have, albeit somewhat general, a strategic plan that is really focusing on specific strategies that we need to employ to get to these bigger outcomes for kids. And so you just can't meet these outcomes without having a plan in place. It's not a challenging plan to get your head wrapped around, and Elaine and I have talked about this in terms of the quality document that the VSA has produced and people have accepted as a vision for Vermont. That's where the work begins. I mean, we've framed where we want to be. Now, how do you put a plan together to get there? So our leadership team meetings, we meet once a week for 2 hours every week, and it's sacrosanct, and we focus on the strategic plan in terms of the resources that we need to be working on. And during those conversations, Alice, is where do we need to make the adjustments? And it's about, first, really making sure we've got everyone on the bus. So we always are checking our assumptions, whether or not our teaching colleagues, support staff, families really are committed to the work. And so what I've talked about with the board is how much of the strategic plan is do we roll out there with parent groups, and how much do we hold as our responsibility as professionals? So it's a good question, and a good plan is one that can be malleable, can adjust, can bend, and I think we have a plan outside of the Common Core of State Standards, which we have to do. That's just part of the strategic plan that we have in place. Kids' voice is really important, and kids change every year. So we have to have in our plan, which we do, opportunities for them to tell us, share with us, show us how they're doing, what their thoughts are. So that demands that we change all the time. So I do believe it's not static, and I think it really has transformed the conversation that we're having.
Okay, before, I don't want to run out of time. We've got 4 minutes, and I just want to spend a little bit of time on, in a traditional governance district, how you might do a report. And I've handed out to you what we did in South Burlington for a transportation report. This is, every school district in the state has to adopt a transportation policy. And either you don't do any transportation at all, or you define what it is that you do. So this would be the closest kind of monitoring report that would fit a traditional state law required policy, just for you to look at and know that that's a bit of connection that takes us out of PG land and applies to any district in the state of Vermont. I'm not saying this is the best, worst, or in between. I'm just saying this is a way to monitor the report and to pay attention to what Kim talked about before. You've got 300 gazillion policies. There is no way with a policy book with any more than 75 that you're ever going to be able to keep on top of what it is you're doing. The best thing you can do is look at those really thick traditional policy governance books and figure out how many of those are pure procedures that you ought to be delegating to your administrators to do, because state law in 563 gives you that opportunity. Take advantage of that and identify the key policies that you ought to be focusing on that gets at what Ramos spoke about, transformational education. Spend your time on that, connecting with your community, and that's how you get it done. I know that we've kind of danced between the two. We'll have time probably for maybe one or two more questions, and this gentleman right here.
Yeah, what's the cost of transitioning from policy governance, or from the traditional to policy governance for the district?
I'm not sure what
Time.
well, it's a
No.
lot of time, but if you
Besides that.
bring in a consultant, I know the VSBA had been doing that for about $4,000 to be able to do the support that a district would need to get that done. I don't know if that's still what it was that 2 years ago. I know Jim Levinsky, the board chair from Hazen Union, is doing some of that work. So what I would say is contact Steve Dale, Vermont School Boards Association, ask the question, and you'll get the answer there.
I think that initially, I think it was Jim who came to speak to us. That was free, so that we could see if it was something that we could understand well enough to know if it was something we were interested in. We bought the policy governance book and began looking at that together as a board. We read that so that we could understand enough about it to know if we were wanting to pursue that model. We did eventually get to a place where we used the resources of the VSBA in a methodical way. Val Gardner came to our strategic retreat, our summer planning retreat, and spent a day with us. Because you do get to a place where you really need the guidance to knock out the policies, and you can try and do it, and it's going to take a lot longer, I think, without that sort of get in a camp and knock it out, or a series of meetings in a row where you're getting the expertise. But a lot of it can be done up front to make sure before you've invested any dollars to understand if it's the right thing for you, and probably with, even inquiring of districts doing it, coming to things like this, or having somebody come to your board meeting and discuss it with your board folks, that probably you could not pay anything.
Well,
The other thing I would say
we're a
is-
small district, so that's what I was worried.
Yeah.
We have less than 1,000 students.
Right.
And compared to Burlington, it's, you got probably that much at one of the schools.
Yeah. Let me just say that you don't have to do policy governance to do good governance. And the VSBA also can come to your district and help you with roles and responsibilities. And that's the foundation of what this is. This is just a fancy name for a system that causes you to have to do it. Carol.
I've been very quiet.
Okay.
Driving me.
Unusual for you, isn't it?
I did not come here to listen to policy governance.
Okay.
We don't have policy governance in that tradition, in what you're saying. We feel is a decent policy governance. Then we're having a policy audit done right now from John Nelson, and we're excited. We've been weeding out and doing some great work. And I think that's the key. And in some of the small, if you want to say small districts, or I want to say traditional boards, I think that's going to be, that was a key thing for you to say, that you had new board members.
Timing in life is
A
everything.
20-year board member sitting right here. I think policies are confusing for new board members, totally, to understand that's your role, and to keep that up. But remember that is what you need to keep up. And so it's the practice, it's the good part, it's the practice of having
I
it.
just think the jargon will turn off your community, your fellow board members. It's just helping explain what it really is. It provides any good governance provides clarity of roles and responsibilities. And I take my roles and responsibilities very seriously, and among that is, creating good policy, transparency, and accountability, holding people to producing outcomes.
Which
that
gives the
too.
trust to the community, so they can understand what you're doing. So that's what you're getting to, is the trust.
And it let us evolve to a strategic plan. I'm glad Mark mentioned it. I know we're pretty much done. I apologize. But I am excited about our budget process being able to reference a document that is living right now. And it was in the works last year, and I don't believe there'll be a dramatically different process of budget development this year than last year, because I know it was in the works for Mark last year. I know it's the way he operates, but it ties everything to the next several years of how we're going to do all the things that we want to do for kids. And it's why we can feel comfortable asking for the money we ask. It's why I can feel comfortable saying that this is really very connected with what you told me you were looking for for outcomes from kids. And
I just want to, I think it just shows the paradox that exists for board members, that your work should really be based on policy. And you have policy books that tell you what your role is. It says board will. And yet when you look at the VSBA publications around roles and responsibilities, it's the antithesis sometimes of what you have in policy. So that's problematic. And I really believe that the audit is a good idea. And if you used as a springboard for the board discussion, what the role and responsibility should be as trustees of the organization, and then look at your policies and look how many times it says school boards will, you're put in a really tough position. I think that most of those policies should be rewritten and said the superintendent will. And yet that's not the way your policies are written. And that's why you hire superintendents. So board members really are stuck in a tough position because of that.
Well, we probably went and asked for the policy audit.
Yeah, that's very, very wise.
Yeah.
That's
To
very
just
wise.
take some of this
Yeah.
like pressure off of
Yeah.
what is going on.
Yeah.
But, and we didn't have a staff this high, it might have been this high.
Yeah.
it's still, it
And they
ends up
grow
along.
exponentially.
Separate your policy from procedures, even the ones that are the high levels, so that there's clarity of what the board does, what the principal does, and what the superintendent does, and that will help you. You don't have to name it PG, TG, or whatever you think is the right moniker. It's about who does what, where, when, why, and how often. So that brings us to the conclusion. I know that a few of you didn't get questions asked. We're happy to entertain that afterwards. But thank you so much for coming, and good luck. Thank you.
No, you didn't.
I'm just going to shut the camera off.
He's been doing more policies recently already.
Yeah.